This dying billionaire had only 5 minutes left to live, and 8 of the world's top medical experts had already given up on him. His wife was screaming in agony, accepting the tragic loss. But just as they were about to pull the white sheet over his face, a 21-year-old youth in a faded uniform rushed in. Everyone laughed and called him crazy, completely blind to the secret he had been hiding all along. With one risky move, he did the impossible, and what happened next left the entire room on their knees in tears. Before we reveal how this invisible hero shocked the world, drop your country's flag in the comments so we can see where you're watching from. And if you believe true heroes wear many faces, hit that subscribe button right now for the full story. Every night, at 10 o'clock, when most residents of New York City were turning on their heaters and preparing for bed, Malik was just beginning his long day. The 21-year-old black youth stood straight in front of the mirror in the employee restroom of St. Jude Hospital. He adjusted the collar of his dark blue uniform, which was slightly faded and hung a bit loose on his well-built frame. His face could not hide the deep exhaustion caused by lack of sleep and the continuous pressures of life. Nevertheless, his dark eyes still radiated an unusual calmness and determination for a young man his age. Malik took a deep breath, exhaled slowly, and offered a faint smile to his reflection to encourage himself before stepping out to face the long night ahead. Malik walked out and began pushing his heavy work cart. The iron cart was loaded with a large bucket, a mop, pine-scented disinfectant, and several clean cloths. His main task every night was to ensure that all the floors in the exclusive wing and the outer corridors of the intensive care unit remained spotless. The work was physically demanding, and the wages he received at the end of each month were actually far from sufficient. However, Malik executed every single mopping motion with an extraordinary level of precision, as if he were working on a valuable piece of art. He never complained or slacked off like the other workers often did. Every time his hands moved the mop handle, Malik's thoughts drifted to the woman he loved most in the world. In a small, cramped rented apartment on the outskirts of the city, his mother lay weak from a severe illness. She required a steady supply of specialized medications that were extremely expensive every month, and this hospital was the only place that gave Malik an opportunity to gather money, no matter how small the amount. This hard labor as a floor cleaner was the single shield keeping his mother alive. His immense love for his mother made the physical exhaustion evaporate every time he started his shift. The atmosphere of the hospital hallway that night was incredibly quiet and cold. The only sounds were the rhythmic steps of Malik's rubber boots, blending with the soft friction of the wet mop against the polished white marble floor. The neon lights on the corridor ceiling reflected a sterile glow, creating an unfamiliar and tense environment. To the passing doctors, the nurses busy with their paperwork, or the hurried family members of patients, Malik was simply an invisible figure. He was viewed merely as a part of the building's background, someone whose only job was to remove dirt from the sight of respectable people. However, no one knew that behind the dark blue uniform and his lowly regarded job, Malik harbored a small secret. Every time he passed the high counters, where the nurses kept stacks of heavy books, Malik's eyes would move quickly, scanning the scientific writings printed there. For Malik, every corner of this hospital was not just a place to earn a living to keep his mother alive, but a hidden sanctuary where he quietly nurtured a great hope that he had not yet had the chance to fulfill. On most nights, his routine followed a predictable clockwork pattern that allowed him to maintain this delicate balance. He would push his heavy iron cart from one end of the intensive care unit hallway to the other, making sure the white marble tiles reflected the bright neon overhead lights perfectly. To anyone watching, he was the perfect employee, a young man who kept his head down, minded his own business, and never caused any trouble. He moved like a shadow, efficient and completely silent. Yet, beneath this facade of normal, quiet routine, cracks were beginning to form in Malik's fragile world. The first sign of trouble was the growing stack of overdue medical bills sitting on the small table next to his mother, Asa bed at home. The cost of her specialized daily injections had recently jumped by 20%, an amount that his current janitorial salary could not possibly cover. To compensate, Malik had started skipping meals, surviving on black coffee and the leftover crackers he found in the hospital break room. His dark skin looked slightly pale under the harsh fluorescent lights, and his uniform felt looser by the day. He was physically pushing his body to its absolute limit, running on nothing but sheer willpower and love for his mother. The second sign of trouble came from the hospital staff itself. while Malik was supposed to focus entirely on the floors. His natural curiosity often drew his attention toward the glass walls of the patient rooms. Whenever a doctor explained a case to a group of residents, or whenever a nurse updated a patient's bedside chart, Malik would slow down his mopping. He would stand near the doorway, pretending to scrub a stubborn stain on the floor, while his sharp eyes quickly scanned the medical terminology, the fluctuating lines on the heart monitors, and the specific dosages written on the whiteboards. He did not do this out of malicious intent. His mind simply craved the knowledge, connecting dots that normal people would completely ignore. Unfortunately, this unusual habit did not go unnoticed. Dr. Robert, the senior chief of medicine who managed the intensive care unit, had already spotted Malik standing too close to the patient rooms on 3 separate occasions that week. Dr. Robert was a strict, traditional man who believed everyone in the hospital should strictly know their place. To him, a 21-year-old floor cleaner hanging around expensive medical equipment was not just a distraction, but a potential liability. Earlier that evening, Dr. Robert had pulled Malik aside near the supply closet, his eyes cold and his voice sharp as a scalpel. He warned Malik that if he was caught loitering or staring at the patient's private medical data one more time, he would be fired immediately without a second thought. Malik had apologized quietly, gripping the handle of his mop tightly to hide the slight trembling of his hands. He knew how fragile his situation was. One wrong move, one small mistake, and he would lose the only source of income keeping his mother alive. Now, as the clock struck midnight, Malik forced himself to stare only at the floor, refusing to look up at the glass windows. He could feel the weight of the world pressing down on his young shoulders, knowing that his stable, quiet life was hanging by a single, thin thread. That thread snapped violently just after 2 o'clock in the morning. The heavy silence of the VIP wing was shattered by the piercing, high-pitched wail of an emergency siren. Red warning lights began to flash frantically along the ceiling, casting an eerie rhythmic glow over the white marble floors. Malik had spent the last 4 hours cleaning. The double doors at the end of the hallway burst open, and a chaotic rush of medical personnel flooded the corridor. At the center of the chaos was a gurney being pushed at full speed by 4 panicked nurses. Lying on it was Evans Farron, the city's most prominent billionaire philanthropist, his face completely pale and his chest barely moving under the oxygen mask. Right behind the gurney rushed Queen Farron, his elegant wife. Her expensive diamond jewelry clinked loudly, but her face was a mask of sheer terror, her eyes wide as she clutched a silk handkerchief to her trembling lips. Dr. Robert led the charge, shouting urgent orders to the 3 other senior specialists running alongside him. Within seconds, a total of 8 top medical experts converged inside the trauma room, sealing the glass doors behind them. Malik quickly pulled his heavy iron cart to the side of the hallway to avoid being trampled, his heart hammering against his ribs. He stood frozen by the wall, gripping his mop handle so tightly his knuckles turned white. Through the large glass viewing window of the intensive care unit, he could see everything. The 8 doctors worked like a frantic machine, administering chest compressions, injecting high-dose adrenaline, and adjusting the dials on a massive multi-million-dollar life support apparatus. Malik's eyes didn't look at the chaos. Instead, his trained gaze immediately locked onto the main monitor. He saw the erratic, chaotic waves of the electrocardiogram suddenly flatten into a straight, solid green line. A long, continuous beep echoed through the glass. Inside the room, the energy instantly deflated. Dr. Robert stepped back, slowly lowering his hands, his head bowed in defeat. The other 7 specialists stopped their movements, shaking their heads and checking their watches. Dr. Robert walked over to Queen Farron, who was waiting just inside the doorway. With a heavy professional solemnity, he placed a hand on her shoulder and spoke the words that felt like a death sentence. He told her that Evans Farron's heart had completely failed, that his brain had been deprived of oxygen for too long, and that there was absolutely nothing more medical science could do. They had tried every advanced procedure available, but the billionaire was gone. Hearing the news, Queen Farron let out a heartbreaking, muffled scream and collapsed into a nearby chair, burying her face in her hands as her body shook with violent sobs. The 8 doctors began disconnecting the secondary monitoring wires, preparing to pronounce the official time of death. Malik stood outside in the cold corridor, staring at the flat line on the monitor, a knot forming in his stomach. His chest heaved as a wave of intense anxiety washed over him. He wasn't just watching a random patient die, he was looking at the medical chart data visible on the side screen, and something deep inside his mind told him the experts were completely wrong. Malik's breath hitched in his throat, and a wave of pure, unadulterated panic washed over him. His mind raced at a frantic speed, analyzing the numbers and the specific waveform that had occurred right before the flatline. He knew exactly what those indicators meant, and the realization terrified him. It was a ratted, deceptive medical anomaly that could easily be mistaken for total brain and heart death. But in reality, the billionaire's body was trapped in a deep, suffocating neurogenic shock. Time was ticking away. Evans Ferrin had less than 5 minutes before the lack of oxygen became truly irreversible. Malik felt a heavy, suffocating weight pressed down on his chest. He looked at Queen Ferran, whose elegant frame was now slumped in a chair, shaking violently as she wept into her silk handkerchief. Her grief was raw, heavy, and filled the room with a tragic emptiness. Then he looked at Dr. Robert and the other 7 specialists, who were calmly packing up their stethoscope cases and filling out the official paperwork to pronounce the time of death. A profound sense of frustration and anger began to bubble up inside Malik's gut. How could these brilliant, highly paid men, with all their expensive degrees and state-of-the-art technology, miss something so critical? How could they just turn their backs and give up on a human life so easily? His hands trembled violently against the cold metal handle of his mop. Malik was trapped in a fierce internal battle. If he kept his mouth shut, stayed in his place, and minded his own business, he would keep his job. He would continue to earn the meager wages needed to buy his mother's medicine. But a man would die a man who didn't have to die. If he spoke up, he would be violating Dr. Roberts' strict warning from earlier that night. He would be crossing a line that a low-wage, 21-year-old black janitor was never supposed to cross. He would almost certainly be fired, ruined, and left unable to support his sick mother. The sheer terror of losing everything fought against the deep, roaring voice of his own conscience. Malik looked back at the flat line on the monitor, the continuous beep ringing like a siren inside his own head. He closed his eyes for a split second, the image of his mother's tired but loving face flashing across his mind. She had always taught him that a person's true worth is measured by what they do when they have the power to help someone else. He couldn't just stand there and let a man die out of fear for his own safety. With a sudden surge of adrenaline that drowned out his fear, Malik dropped his mop. The heavy wooden handle clattered loudly against the polished marble floor, the sharp sound echoing through the quiet corridor. Malik didn't care who heard it. He straightened his back, took a deep, steadying breath, and marched directly toward the heavy glass doors of the trauma room. His heart was hammering wildly against his ribs, but his steps were firm and deliberate. He was about to step into a storm, but there was no turning back now. Malik pushed open the heavy glass doors of the trauma room, the sudden hiss of the pneumatic seal drawing every eye in the room toward him. Dr. Robert looked up from his clipboard, his brow furrowing into a deep, angry scowl as he recognized the young janitor. Queen Ferran slowly lifted her tear-stained face, her eyes blinking in utter confusion at the sight of a young black youth in a faded blue uniform invading her husband's deathbed. The remaining 7 medical specialists stood frozen, stunned by the sheer audacity of the intrusion. Malik did not hesitate. He took 3 large steps forward, stopping just at the foot of the bed where Evans Ferran lay perfectly still. He kept his voice low, clear, and remarkably steady despite the adrenaline surging through his veins. He looked directly at Dr. Robert and said that Evans Ferran was not dead, that his nervous system had merely locked up due to an acute vagal blockage caused by the heavy cardiac medication they had administered, and that he knew exactly how to restart the man's heart. The words fell like a heavy stone into a quiet pool, leaving the room in a stunned, breathless silence for 3 long seconds. Then, the reaction came. Dr. Robert let out a sharp, mocking bark of laughter, tossing his clipboard onto the metal side table. He asked Malik if he had completely lost his mind, demanding to know since when a boy who scrubs toilets for a living had the right to lecture the top 8 cardiologists in the state on how to do their jobs. The other doctors joined in, chuckling dryly and shaking their heads at the sheer absurdity of the situation. They looked at Malik with a mixture of amusement and utter disdain, viewing his desperate intervention as nothing more than a pathetic, uneducated cry for attention. Queen Farron's confusion instantly turned into blinding rage. She stood up from her chair, her expensive silk handkerchief clenched in her fist as she pointed a trembling, diamond-ringed finger at Malik's face. She screamed at him to get away from her husband, asking Dr. Robert how a common cleaner was allowed to enter a restricted area, to mock her grief and disrespect her husband's body. Her voice cracked with emotion as she demanded Malik be thrown out immediately. She openly mocked his background, shouting that a young man from the streets, who couldn't even afford a decent pair of shoes, had absolutely no right to speak to her, let alone pretend he could perform a miracle that 8 medical geniuses could not. Malik stood his ground, enduring the harsh laughter and the biting insults without flinching. He didn't look at Queen Farron's angry face, nor did he look at Dr. Robert's arrogant smirk. Instead, his eyes remained locked onto the side monitor, watching the tiny, almost imperceptible microfluctuations in Evans Farron's residual brain activity. The 5-minute window was rapidly closing. There were less than 2 minutes left before the damage became permanent. Malik knew he had a chance, a genuine opening to save a life. But the wall of prejudice and arrogance standing in front of him was growing taller by the second, threatening to destroy his only opportunity to help. Dr. Robert did not waste another moment. His face turned a deep, furious crimson as he stepped between Malik and the hospital bed, blocking the young man's view. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his internal radio transmitter, and barked a sharp command to the hospital security desk. He demanded that 4 armed security guards come up to the VIP intensive care unit immediately to remove an unstable intruder who was disrupting a code blue emergency scene. The other 7 doctors closed ranks around the bed, physically forming a human barrier to ensure Malik could not take another step toward Evans Farron. Queen Farron continued to shout hysterically, her voice echoing off the sterile walls of the room. She demanded to see the hospital director, vowing to file a multi-million-dollar lawsuit against the entire institution for allowing a lowly floor cleaner to traumatize her during the worst moment of her life. She looked at Malik with absolute disgust, telling him that his presence was an insult to her family name and that he would pay dearly for his arrogance. Within less than 60 seconds, the heavy double doors of the intensive care unit burst open again. 4 large, burly security guards in dark uniforms rushed into the room, their heavy boots thudding against the floor. Dr. Robert pointed a trembling finger at Malik, shouting for them to grab him and throw him out of the building immediately. 2 of the guards grabbed Malik by his upper arms, twisting his limbs backward and pinning his shoulders. Malik did not fight back physically. He knew that any sign of violence would completely ruin any chance he had of saving the man on the bed. Instead, as the guards began dragging his feet across the floor toward the exit, Malik looked over his shoulder and shouted at the top of his lungs, his voice cutting through the chaos. He called out to Dr. Robert, telling him to check the patient's sublingual temperature and look at the pupillary reflex one more time before they covered his face. He yelled that the adrenaline they injected had caused a massive neurogenic block, not a permanent cardiac arrest. Dr. Robert merely sneered, waving his hand dismissively to tell the guards to hurry up. The guards dragged Malik out of the trauma room, past his spilled mop and bucket, and down the long, cold corridor toward the service elevator. Before the elevator doors closed, the hospital's night supervisor appeared, his face tight with anger. He looked at Malik's pinned arms and told him that he was fired effective immediately, that his final paycheck would be withheld for gross misconduct, and that he was permanently banned from setting foot on St. Jude Hospital property again. As the elevator descended toward the basement exit, Malik felt a cold, paralyzing dread settle into his chest. In less than 5 minutes, he had lost his job, his income, and the only means he had to buy the life-saving medication his mother needed so desperately. Even worse, he knew that upstairs in the VIP room, the clock had just run out for Evans Farron. The security guard's roughie shoved Malik out through the heavy metal back doors of the hospital, straight into the freezing, rain-slicked alleyway. The heavy doors slammed shut behind him with a loud, final click, leaving him completely alone in the dark. A bitter, icy wind swept through the narrow space, cutting right through his thin blue uniform. Malik stood frozen under the dim amber glow of a single street lamp, water dripping from his short hair onto his face. His hands, still wet from the mop water, began to numb from the biting cold. He slowly walked out of the alley and stood on the deserted sidewalk, facing the massive, towering glass facade of St. Jude Hospital. He looked up toward the fourth floor, where the bright, white lights of the intensive care unit were visible. Tears of utter helplessness and frustration finally welled up in his eyes, mixing with the rain on his cheeks. A suffocating sense of despair pressed down on his shoulders, so heavy that it felt physically painful. He had tried to do the right thing. He had tried to save a human life, using the knowledge he had fought so hard to gain, but his reward was absolute ruin. Malik reached into his pocket and pulled out his cheap, cracked smartphone. His fingers trembled as he unlocked the screen to look at his banking application. The balance was nearly zero. He then opened a text message from his mother's pharmacy, reminding him that the next batch of specialized heart injections had to be paid for by tomorrow morning, or the delivery would be cancelled. He let out a ragged, broken sob, burying his face in his hands. Without his job, without his final paycheck, his mother would miss her dosage. The thought of losing her because of his choice tonight tore his heart into pieces. He felt completely defeated, smaller than he had ever felt in his entire life. Every voice of doubt inside his head began to scream. He told himself that Dr. Robert was right. He was just a 21-year-old nobody from a poor neighborhood. Why did he think he could change anything? Why did he think anyone would ever listen to a black youth in a janitor's uniform? The world felt incredibly cold, cruel, and profoundly unfair. He had lost his livelihood, his dignity, and his mother's safety, all within the span of a few minutes. The continuous beep of Evans Farron's flatlining monitor seemed to echo through the cold night air, ringing loudly in Malik's ears. He knew that right now, up on that fourth floor, the doctors were probably drawing the white sheet over the billionaire's face, while Queen Farron wept over a death that could have been prevented. All hope seemed completely gone, scattered into the dark New York night like the falling rain. Malik slumped against a cold stone pillar near the hospital's closed main entrance, his body shaking from the freezing cold and the overwhelming weight of his failure. He was at the absolute rock bottom of his life, with nowhere left to turn. But as Malik stared at the bleak reflection of the city lights in a puddle of rainwater, a sudden change occurred within him. The paralyzing fear for his own future began to dissolve, replaced by a fierce, burning clarity. He looked up at the fourth-floor window again. If he walked away now, Evans Farron would die. His mother would eventually lose her anchor, and Malik would have to live the rest of his life, knowing he let fear win. He remembered his mother's voice, a steady whisper in his mind. "A life is a life, Malik. Never let the world make you cold." With a sudden sharp intake of breath, Malik straightened his posture. The trembling in his hands stopped. He was making a choice that was incredibly dangerous, reckless, and could easily land him in a jail cell by morning. But it was a choice he knew he had to make. He sprinted away from the main entrance, running along the side of the massive brick building toward the rear loading dock. He knew the hospital's layout like the back of his hand. He had spent months cleaning every single square inch of it. Malik reached the heavy metal bay doors where the linen delivery trucks parked. He waited in the shadows for a split second until a tired laundry worker pushed a massive canvas bin out to the dock, leaving the heavy security door propped open with a plastic wedge. Malik didn't hesitate. He slipped past the worker like a shadow, entering the warm, brightly lit basement corridor. Instead of taking the heavily monitored service elevator, he lunged for the concrete emergency stairwell, taking the steps 3 at a time. His heart hammered furiously against his ribs, his lungs burning with every breath as he ascended to the 4th floor. Reaching the VIP wing, Malik cracked the heavy fire door open. The hallway was momentarily quiet. The security guards had gone back down to their main desk, believing the intruder was gone for good. Malik sprinted down the carpeted corridor, his rubber boots making no sound. He reached the trauma room and threw the doors open with a loud thud, entering like a whirlwind. Inside, the scene was exactly as he had feared. A white cotton sheet had already been pulled up over Evans Farron's chest, covering everything up to his chin. Dr. Robert was signing the final death certificate at the desk, while Queen Farron sat slumped in the corner, her face swollen from crying. The other doctors were quietly conversing in the back. Before anyone could even react to his sudden reappearance, Malik rushed to the side of the bed. Dr. Robert gasped, dropping his pen and shouting for someone to stop him, but Malik was already moving with absolute precision. He reached into his deep uniform pocket and pulled out a small, amber glass vial of highly concentrated eucalyptus and peppermint oil, simple herbal extract he always carried to soothe his mother's chronic respiratory congestion, with his left hand. Malik reached under the white sheet and pressed his thumb firmly into the deep nerve recess right beneath Evans Ferren's jawline, applying a precise rhythmic pressure to stimulate the blocked vagus nerve. With his right hand, he broke the cap off the vial and held the powerful, sharp scent directly beneath the billionaire's pale nostrils. "What are you doing? Get away from him. You're desecrating a corpse," Dr. Robert yelled, lunging forward to grab Malik's shoulders. Queen Ferren screamed in horror, covering her mouth as the other doctors rushed forward to physically tackle Malik to the ground. Malik braced himself, refusing to let go of the patient, putting everything he had on the line for this one, final, desperate second. Dr. Robert's heavy hands slammed into Malik's shoulders, and two other doctors grabbed his waist, violently pulling him backward. But just as Malik was about to be dragged down to the floor, a violent, gasping sound shattered the chaos in the room. Evans Ferren's chest arched upward with a sudden, massive convulsion. The billionaire sucked in a deep, desperate breath of air, his eyes flying wide open. The long, continuous flatline beep on the monitor abruptly broke, replaced by a rapid, frantic, yet perfectly steady beep-beep as his heart rate surged back to life. The pale, blue tint on the old man's face instantly began to fade, replaced by a warm, rushed flush of blood. The entire room froze in an absolute, breathless silence. Dr. Robert dropped his hands from Malik's shoulders, his jaw slacking as he stared at the monitor in utter disbelief. The other 7 medical specialists stepped back, their faces turning completely white as if they were looking at a ghost. Queen Ferren let out a sharp gasp, her hand trembling violently over her mouth as she watched her husband slowly turn his head, blink his eyes, and look around the room, fully conscious. The readers, the doctors, and Queen Ferren had all assumed from the beginning that Malik was just an uneducated, low-wage janitor who had miraculously performed a lucky piece of traditional folk medicine or a random alternative trick. But the incredible reality was entirely different. In truth, Malik was not a career cleaner at all. He was a brilliant, top-tier third-year medical student at Columbia University who had been forced to take an emergency academic leave just 6 months prior because he could no longer afford the tuition while simultaneously paying for his mother's astronomical medical expenses. Furthermore, the highly specific neurological stimulation technique Malik had just used, combined with the sharp olfactory shock of the concentrated essential oil, was not a random guess. It was based entirely on a highly experimental, forgotten research paper written 40 years ago by a brilliant neurologist. That neurologist was none other than Dr. Charles Ferren, the late father of Evans Ferren himself. Malik had stumbled upon Dr. Charles's original, dust-covered research journals in the hospital's deep archival library during his late-night cleaning shifts, studying them meticulously for hours while everyone else ignored them. Malik had known from the very second he saw the unique cardiac waveform on the monitor that Evans Ferren had inherited his father's rare, undocumented, hypersensitive vagal condition. The heavy modern adrenaline the 8 doctors had injected had not restarted the heart. Instead, it had accidentally triggered a massive, temporary neurogenic lock that mimicked total death. The high-tech machines were fooled. The 8 brilliant experts were fooled. But Malik's sharp, educated mind had connected the dots immediately because he had read the elder Ferren's exact notes. Evans Ferren looked up at Malik, his breathing stabilizing as he noticed the faded blue janitor uniform. The billionaire's voice was weak but completely clear as he reached out a trembling hand toward the young man. He looked at Dr. Robert, then at his stunned wife, and whispered that the young man in front of them had just pulled his mind out of a dark, suffocating trap. The miracle was not magic. It was pure, flawless science, delivered by the one person the entire room had deemed completely worthless. Queen Ferren fell to her knees beside the bed, weeping tears of intense relief as she clutched her husband's warm hand. She looked up at Malik, her face flushed with deep shame and regret. The arrogance that had defined her just moments ago completely vanished. She apologized profusely, her voice trembling as she confessed how wrong she had been to judge him by his clothing and the color of his skin. Dr. Robert stood completely motionless, staring at the floor in a daze, his pride was entirely shattered. He knew that his narrow-mindedness had almost cost a man his life, and that the young man he had tried to throw out possessed a level of observation and dedication that far exceeded his own. Without a word, Dr. Robert quietly stepped back, bowed his head to Malik in a silent gesture of profound respect, and walked out of the room to cancel the termination order. Within a few days, Evans Farhan made a full and remarkable recovery. After hearing the full story from his wife and learning about Malik's true background, the billionaire immediately took action. He used his immense wealth to fully clear all of Malik's mother's outstanding medical debts and arranged for her to receive the highest quality private healthcare available, ensuring she would never suffer from a lack of medication again. Furthermore, Evans established a permanent, prestigious medical scholarship foundation in Malik's name, fully funding the remaining years of his education at Columbia University and guaranteeing him a residency spot at the top hospital in the city upon his graduation. 1 year later, Malik stood in the very same corridor of St. Jude Hospital. He was no longer wearing the faded blue janitor uniform or pushing a heavy iron cart filled with cleaning supplies. Instead, he wore a crisp, white doctor's coat with his name neatly embroidered on the chest. He paused for a moment, looking down at his reflection in the pristine, polished white marble floor that he used to clean every night. The long, exhausting nights of labor were behind him, but the humility and discipline he learned during those hours remained deeply rooted in his heart. As he watched a young janitor push a cart past him in the hallway, Malik offered the worker a warm, respectful smile. He reminded himself of the most important lesson his journey had taught him. True value, intelligence, and dignity are never determined by a person's social status, the job they hold, or the assumptions others make about them. A person's true worth is defined entirely by the depth of their knowledge, the strength of their character, and their willingness to act with courage and compassion when a human life is on the line. Malik turned around and walked toward the intensive care unit, ready to save lives not just as a brilliant physician, but as a man who knew exactly what it felt like to be invisible.